Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy and very pleased to give a little introduction to this program this afternoon. And on behalf of all my colleagues in the African and Middle Eastern Division, the Asian Division, and the Geography and Maps Division, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm Joan Weeks. I'm the Assistant Chief in the African and Middle Eastern Division, and we're very pleased to present this program on the cartographic history of Afghanistan, the modern and colonial periods by Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. But before we start today's program and introduce our speaker, I'd like to give you a brief overview of these divisions and their resources in the hopes that you'll return and come back and use the collections. The AMID, or African and Middle Eastern Division, is a custodial division, which means we house the collections. It's comprised of 3 sections that build and serve the collections to researchers around the world. We cover over 78 countries and more than 24 languages. The Africa section includes all the countries of sub-Saharan Africa. The Near East section covers all of the Arab countries, including North Africa and the Middle East. Turkey, Turkic Central Asia, Iran, Afghanistan, Armenia, and Georgia. The Hebraic section is responsible for Judaic and Hebraic worldwide. And our reading room, I want to tell everyone, is located on its new location on the 2nd floor of the Jefferson Building. You take the elevators as though you were going to the main reading room and then get off at the 2nd floor and walk through the rare book offices to the Northeast Pavilion. The Asian Reading Room provides access to more than 4 million items in over 133 Asian languages, such as Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Tibetan, Hindi, Thai, and many others. In the reading room, researchers can use the Asian Division collections of printed materials, microform databases, and confer with reference librarians to answer research questions about the countries of East and Southeast Asia. And their reading room is located on the 1st floor of the Jefferson Building, just off the Great Hall, down a corridor past the Congressional Reading Room. The Geography and Map Division provides cartographic and geographic information for all parts of the world to Congress, federal agencies, state and local governments, and the scholarly community, as well as to the general public. It is the largest and most comprehensive cartographic collection in the world, numbering over 5.2 million maps. And I'm going to reference works, globes. They have all sorts of multimedia formats, plastic relief models, and all sorts of interesting formats for geographic materials. I'd also like to invite you to try out our Four Corners blog with special posts by our Hispanic, European, Asian, African, Middle East Division specialists, as well as follow us on Facebook. That way you'll get to learn about new programs that we're going to be offering in the future. And I'd also like to remind you that this program is being videotaped, and if you ask questions at the end, you're implicitly giving us permission to use your voice in the recording. And now I'd like to invite up Cynthia Smith to give us a little overview, continued overview of the Geography and Map Division. Thank you.
Okay, I've brought about 6 maps from our holdings, and these are mainly 19th century maps, and to deal with right there if you need anything. Okay. I'm going to briefly describe each one of them as they come up. They'll be up here shortly. Let me just advance it a little bit to get there. Okay, the first one is from 1879, and it was published by the Corps of Engineers, U.S. Army. And the title, Seat of War in Asia, refers to the Second Anglo-Afghan War. It lasted 2 years. It was triggered because the British were worried about the Russian influence in Afghanistan, and they sent 40,000 troops to Afghanistan. They were defeated 2 years later in 1880. There was the second one is from 1855. And this was the year the Treaty of Peshawar was signed between England and Afghanistan. The British, again, were worried about Russian influence and their movements southward, and the Treaty of Peshawar agreed for Great Britain and Afghanistan to be friends of each other's friends and enemies of each other's enemies. Okay, the next one is a panoramic view from the Indus River region to the Russian territories, and it shows 2 British soldiers in the lower right-hand corner overlooking the Indus River region. It was published by the Letts Company in London, and they were a company that produced stationery and diaries. Okay, this one was published in 1893 by Hunt and Eaton, an American company. 1893 is the year the Durand Line was drawn by Sir Mortimer Durand, a British civil servant, and the ruler of Afghanistan at the time, Abdurrahman Khan. It cut through Pashtun tribal areas and caused a lot of conflict between Afghanistan and British India, and later Afghanistan and Pakistan. Okay, this is of a historical region in Afghanistan, Kafiristan. It was published in 1881 by the Stanford Company in London for the Royal Geographic Society. Kafiristan's in the eastern part of Afghanistan. It was later named Nuristan in 1906. This is of the Helmand River region, and a famous British geographer, Sir Robert Markham, it was prepared for a report that he gave to the Royal Geographical Society, and a month later, the map was published in their proceedings. I think I'm going to turn this over to Harad now. We have 4 of the maps over there, and the one of the Second Anglo-Afghan War and the panoramic view up here for you to view.
Thank you, Cynthia. Everyone, thank you very much for making time and coming. This is a wonderful joint collaborative effort here between 3 divisions, as you see. And if you bear with me, I'm going to quickly try to get the PowerPoints to work. For some reason, it doesn't seem to escape. Here we go. Before I start, I also want to thank Dr. Mary Jane Deeb, our former chief, for actually coming here and attending. This is a great honor to have you here. I am going to focus on Afghanistan from the prism, essentially, of linguistics and cultural maps, and how it kind of connects to what we call the Iranian world, or Iranic world. The reason why is there is still some confusion for many how Afghanistan fits or doesn't fit. It's crucial to sort of look at the language map here. I have 2 language maps for you. This is a map of all the various Iranic languages presently and today in the world. In the western side, in sort of a brown color, you're seeing the Kurdish region to the west. And then the brown is the Persian, blue is Pashto, and then green is Balochi. Those are the 4 main major languages. And as you see, the brown for Persian sort of bleeds into, from Iran into Afghanistan up into Central Asia. This map is also interesting because it showcases the dialects of Persian. You have the darker green for Farsi, which is what is the language is referred to in Iran. And in Afghanistan, they have the sort of a lighter green, which is, in Afghanistan, they also refer to the language as Dari. And in Central Asia, it's referred to as Tajiki, or sometimes Tajiki, sometimes Farsi. So the language has 3 regional names. And the goal really here is to show you the widespread of the language family. And I also want to speak as far as how Afghanistan connects. This is a great map because it shows you the vastness, yet the focus on the region as well. Afghanistan has played a major role in Iranian or Persian identity for various epochs and periods, both in the pre-Islamic context as well as the post-Islamic. In the pre-Islamic context, there's some debate, but it's believed that Zoroastrianism and Zoroaster comes from the region that is now Eastern Iran, Khorasan, and Afghanistan, and that's the area that you see right here on the northern side of Afghanistan. The languages today that resemble closest to Avesta, or the language of Zoroastrian texts, are the Pamir languages, this dark blue patch that you see in there, and Pashto. Pashto and Pamiri are the closest to Old Persian, and they're part of the eastern branch of Iranian languages. And Iranian languages do have an eastern and western branch. And the funny thing is that the eastern branch, one group of it is in essentially the Pashto and Pamiri are in the east, but the other essentially East Iranian languages, Ossetian or Osset, which is up in the Caucasus, between Georgia and Russia, up on top. So it's interesting to see how the Eastern dialects or Eastern forms of Iranian languages are spread out. And this also ties in with the civilization as well. Pashto identity or Afghan identity has played a crucial role in pre-Islamic times for a couple of reasons. The Achaemenid Persians, the Parthian Persians, the Sasanians looked east often. They were familiar with the West, but they looked east. All their lore, they referred to lands of the rising sun. There was talk of Khorasan, of Mirasan. Khorasan and Mirasan is essentially what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. And there is a fascination with China and India. And the easternmost frontier to access that was what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia. So you have that interesting dynamic where the eastern lands played an interesting buffer role. And it's in these same regions that you also have the development of very interesting hybrid cultures, the Kushans, the Bactrians, and Sogdians. The Kushans brought in, they had Greek influence from the time of the Parthians and Alexander, but they mixed it in with the native Zoroastrian along with the Indian Buddhist tradition, and you have these wonderful Kandaharan and Kushan style of Buddhism, which is an interesting hybrid of this region. In the post-Islamic period, it's no secret that the western part of Iran, or what is now Fars, was referred to as Iraq Ajami, or Persian-speaking Iraq, if you like. The eastern region, Khorasan, is where Persian comes back to life in what is now Khorasan and Afghanistan. And from the 7th, 8th century, what is now Central Asia and Afghanistan, Rudaki and then Ferdowsi, and all these great poets start in this region. So Afghanistan plays a major role in the formation of what is Islamic Persian language and civilization. This continuity continues all the way until you get to the 1900s, and with the coming of the Safavids in Iran, there is a schism where the western regions become Shiite and the eastern regions become Sunni, remain Sunni, and you have the Afghan invasion, if you like. I don't see it as an invasion, I see it as a riot, because the Afghans at the time were part of this larger Safavid world. They rebelled against the central government and sacked Isfahan. So from then on, 18th, 19th century is where you have a distinctly, clearly Afghan identity, and more so Pashtun identity. So to give you an Iranian context, the Afghan world is integrally part of the Iranian world, is seen as something that is connected to the core, yet there is a regional dynamic that is also very rich, often being right on the location-wise where it is, a place in which influences from the east, be it India or China or Central Asia, and later Turkic and Mongol dynasties also come in through this side, through the east. All of this happens in this richly complex region that is today Afghanistan. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to John Lohr, our Indian specialist, so he will give you the Indian context of how Afghanistan connects. Thank you.
And likewise, welcome to everyone here today. My name is John Lohr. I'm the Asian Division's representative here as the reference librarian for South Asia, which includes countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And as someone who's within the field of South Asian studies, I'm really excited to have our speaker, Dr. Hanifi, here today because his work really represents some new and important connections between the two fields of South Asian studies on one hand and Afghanistan studies on the other. So at the Library of Congress, the South Asian Collection in the Asian Reading Room is the public gateway to access quite literally hundreds of thousands of materials that are in Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Punjabi, Sindhi, Mewari, Nepali, a bunch of languages, South Asian languages from India and as well as the rest of the South Asian region. And of course, we invite everyone here today to come and explore our collections in our reading rooms and contact us through email, through our Ask a Librarian service with any questions about our collections. Most of our collection, or most of our acquisition, comes from two overseas offices, one in New Delhi, India, established in 1962, and the other in Islamabad, Pakistan, established in 1965. And the Islamabad office is also instrumental in the routine acquisition of materials from Iran and from Afghanistan as well. And oftentimes I think we think of these countries, there's Afghanistan, there's Pakistan, there's India, as existing in these separate silos that kind of exist kind of distinctly from one another. And sometimes we might even think of our divisions that way as well. There's the Asian division, there's the African Middle Eastern division. But one of the things that I really enjoy about working at the Library of Congress are events like these, which really allow for the collaboration across multiple divisions so that we can see South Asia and Afghanistan represented across the library, so that I can learn about maps that we have in Cynthia's division in Geography and Maps, and we can also work with Mughal scholars of Mughal India who come to mine and Herad's reading rooms. And this all really relates to the excitement for today's lecture by Dr. Hanifi because his work brings together both Afghanistan and the geographic region of South Asia. And from the vantage point of South Asia studies, there's a great deal of engagement with Afghanistan in terms of the classical or the ancient period, for example, the ancient Buddhist region of Gandhara. And of course, in the modern context, Afghanistan figures importantly in geopolitical affairs, the study of economic ties between different states in the region. But what Dr. Hanifi's work really adds is historical depth to this relationship, and he really focuses on that period of time of South Asia's colonial and immediately post-colonial period. And it's all the more engaging, I think, that his work, as we'll see today, is so visually compelling, drawing on a selection of maps that are produced from the perspective of colonial India and other areas throughout the world. And that his work, especially his most recent work, draws on the work of Mount Stuart Elphinstone, a major figure in colonial Indian history. And maps are really interesting objects in and of themselves, right? Because they attempt to tell us something, where borders are, where the border begins, where it ends, people who belong in those borders or who don't belong in those borders. But it's also something that calls to mind the religion scholar Jonathan Z. Smith's axiom that a map is not territory, which for a talk like today, we might think of a map as something that's produced by human hands, that has human agendas wrapped into it, and really can also reveal as much as it conceals as well. And I think Dr. Hanifi's work really kind of brings that to the forefront, which leads me to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi is professor of history at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia, where he teaches courses on the Middle East and South Asia. Dr. Hanifi's research addresses subjects like colonial political economy, the Pashto language, photography, cartography, animal and environmental studies, and also Orientalism in the context of Afghanistan. His first book, Connecting Histories in Afghanistan, Market Relations and State Formation on a Colonial Frontier, was first published as a Gutenberg ebook and then published in 2009 by Stanford University Press. And his second most recent book, Mount Stuart Elphinstone in South Asia, Pioneer of British Colonial Rule, was just published this year by Oxford University Press. And Dr. Hanifi will be on hand after today's lecture with copies of Connecting Histories for purchase and for signing. So let's all give him a warm welcome and learn some about Afghanistan.
glad you're here to help you. Well, I have to say how grateful I am for all of the units that have supported this opportunity for me to share a bit of my work with you. I've known Hirad for many years, and he's been such a wonderful supporter for Afghanistan. And we have a really great kind of moment in time where a number of PhD students are literally getting their degrees this summer, and many of them have worked here with Hirad. John is also a great supporter for things related to Afghanistan, and I just appreciate his general sensibilities and also wherewithal when it comes to Afghanistan from the South Asian perspective. And to Cynthia, I have to say how grateful I am for your time and your effort to bring up these maps for the audience. And I've been enjoying myself most recently this last year in the Geography and Maps division, and just am overwhelmed at the number of resources. And my job here today is to try to share some of them with you. It's a special pleasure to have Mary Jane Deeb in the audience, who's really also been such a long-term supporter of Afghanistan. I'm very grateful for all the administrative layers of support that it takes to bring something like this together. So it's just absolutely appropriate that Afghanistan works in a kind of synergistic way between different regions and units, because that is the key to understanding the environment. That is multiple different perspectives. It's critical not to isolate the country in terms of understanding it on its own terms. To understand Afghanistan, you need to understand its relationships to its surrounding environments. And this is a great opportunity to sort of elaborate on that. It's a really special moment also for a couple of different reasons. First of all, Eid Mubarak. It's a wonderful, auspicious day to have Eid al-Fitr on this moment, and it really highlights how important Islam is in the sort of mapping of Afghanistan, as we'll see today. It really brought Afghanistan into a new epistemological terrain. I'd like to say a few words about that. But it's also very curious because 1919 was the date of Afghanistan's independence, which makes 2019 the centennial of Afghanistan independence, which is such an also very interesting moment to have this opportunity. And in terms of not anniversaries as much as recognition or sort of reflecting on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. This is a really, it's sort of a big year for to give some historical conjunctures a sort of second look in a number of ways. So part of my job here today is to expose you to the wide assortment of maps of Afghanistan and the surrounding region through a long stretch of time. And it'll be sort of an Eid feast for your eyes in that sense, because I will be going through a lot of images. That's mainly to just sort of do some sort of respect to the sources that are held here at the Library of Congress. So the progress through those images will be sort of slow, and then we'll move a little bit faster as we get going. So I appreciate your patience and then your tolerance for the speed at which we're going to go. So what I'd like to do is try to give you a sense that my interest is really as maps as imperial projections. And it's really that frame of reference that makes Afghanistan so well mapped. Because it seems like almost every empire that's ever existed has had some mapping interest in Afghanistan. And of course, that's probably an over-exaggeration. But we have a wide assortment of maps: American maps, British maps, French maps, German maps, Italian, Prussian, Russian. It really is kind of unending. the mapping of Afghanistan is a project that's continuing aggressively as we speak. So my focus is really to bring the British colonial, imperial perspective to bear on this subject of mapping. And in that sense, I'm really concerned with what's happening in India, that is British India, as well as the kind of imperial metropole, that is London and England. So in many ways, my work on maps is reflected in the two books that I'm just so happy are here. And we will see quite a bit from both of those books in due course. And I'm sorry we couldn't have the second book available for you here today, but there is a discount flyer that's floating around if you're interested. It's a benefit of sharing some time today. So broadly, I just want to say that maps can be approached from a number of different perspectives, certainly the artistic and aesthetic perspective. But there's a large sort of set of different knowledge formations that come to bear on maps. Lots of different sciences and interests. And so really, we can look at maps as sort of cultural products, as textual products, as geographic reference points. But the key really is that the reliance on maps and the sort of emphasis on maps is a condition of modernity, is what I'd kind of like to argue. And the coming of the modern age brought with it a new kind of mapping impulse that is around nation states and kind of borders and boundaries, whereas in the pre-modern era, it's more about mapping regions, maybe even ecologies and climates. So there's really quite a substantive shift between pre-modern and modern maps. And if we are able to pull it off, I'd like to think about another discussion of, shall we say, national mapping in Afghanistan. That is Afghanistan's mapping of its own terrain in the 20th century. But when we talk about maps and imperial mapping, we have to kind of remember modernity raises a fundamental question about empires and what is standing in the way as empires seek to achieve their goals. And in that way, maps become central to the imperial process. And the conceptual point to note is that maps really prefigure conquest. It's not that you conquer a place and then map it. The argument is that maps, sort of a progressive impulse to map, is a big part of the process of conquest. And so we have to be really respectful for the wonderful knowledge formations, the beauty of these maps, but they are tools of power. They are imperial products, and in sort of a very basic way, they are used to kill people in some sort of way that in the modern era, we see some reactions against maps and over-mapping our movements and facial recognition and these kinds of, again, mapping in modernity. There seems to be a real important relationship here. So what I want to do is, by necessity, sort of choose my sides of Afghanistan. And I will begin really coming up at Afghanistan from the West, that is through Iran and Islam. Later in the talk, we'll look at sort of colonial and imperial mapping through the British and British India. But the sort of progress of the talk then will be kind of uneven here. I hope to get to the First and Second War material sooner rather than later. But what we need to recognize now as we begin to move is that these boundaries of Afghanistan through which we recognize the country today took shape during the colonial era. In the last third of the 19th century, there were different boundary processes in the East, West, North, and South that involved the Persians, the Ottomans, the Russians, the British, and Afghans. And so this map that we must look at as to some extent constructed, not artificial, but definitely constructed through the agency of imperial and colonial powers. And that leads us to conclude that Afghanistan itself, in many ways, came into sort of being through colonial agency. At the same time, we can appreciate that Afghanistan's relationship to colonialism was kind of uneven. People have called it a para-colonial environment, not fully colonized, not fully independent. I prefer the word crypto-colony. I see Afghanistan as a crypto-colony, where its very deep past, and I really do want to emphasize, Afghanistan has a deep past, but a very sort of shallow or thin historiography. There's a deep past with a shallow history. And one of the reasons for that is because Afghanistan is a zone of mobility. Historically, that region of Afghanistan that we can see is a conduit for various kinds of mobile peoples. And the bounding of the country really did sort of transform those mobility patterns in substantive ways. And let's remember again how difficult it is to map mobility. So the point to take away is that there's something to some extent unnatural about the effects of this map on the larger historical relationships that Afghanistan has had with surrounding regions. Okay. To give you a sense of the resources I'm calling upon in my work, we have thousands of maps online, just going around. My first book is really predicated on maps found at the David Rumsey site that is just so fabulously rich for all parts of the world and all eras. Some of my conceptual understanding comes from this History of Cartography series that's, again, online and available at the University of Chicago. Up in the right-hand corner, the University of Texas has a fantastic online map collection that is continually growing. I just saw a fantastic set of aeronautical maps of Afghanistan up there since the last time I checked. In the center, we have the World Digital Library, which has a massive assortment, thousands, I want to say 1,067 relevant map hits. Again, all available online. And the relationship between the World Digital Library and the Library of Congress is intimate. There's an organic relationship there. And I need to also reference the significance of UNESCO funding and Carnegie Corporation of New York funding to get the Persianate digital components of the World Digital Library up and available for everyone online. Just a fantastic thing. On the bottom right corner is a volume that's in the library downstairs. And downstairs in the Geography and Maps division, there's certainly archival maps, but just also a wonderful library. And this is, those maps of Persia really contain hundreds of images of Afghanistan as well. Finally, on the bottom right corner, at the University of Michigan, there's a wonderful online repository for the colonial mapping subject that I'm dealing with here in principle today. So I want you to be aware of that. And again, we've heard so much about the map resources available here on site physically. It is absolutely important to recognize that Islam is one of many kind of civilizational or imperial formations that's affected Afghanistan. It's important to recognize that Islam brought with it a new epistemology about time and space. And what Islam brought is a new calendar, a lunar calendar, the Hijri calendar. We're experiencing it with Eid today. It also brought with it a new sense of spatial priorities with Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. And through the progress of Islam, its historic expansion, very broad, discontinuous those elements of Islam, its intellectual and its geographic constitution, pay a tremendous amount of influence on the mapping of Afghanistan in so many different ways. So what Islam did was not create its sort of new epistemological framework out of whole cloth. It absorbed what came before in really fantastic, organized ways. And when we think of the mapping of Afghanistan, we can certainly go back to ancient history and the Indus Valley civilization and sort of argue about sites and what they might mean map-wise. But it's really the Greco sort of Roman Mediterranean mapping of Afghanistan that draws a lot of attention. And we can't begin that discussion without referencing Herodotus. And Herodotus is so significant for mapping what is then the known world, or the ecumene. And that sort of heritage of Alexander's passing through Persia and Iran, and the literary legacy, the potential mapping legacy of that period, fed directly into Islam. And Islam, to achieve its mapping goals, used new technologies, and this is a modern astrolabe, built modern, 2013, built in Tabriz. But it is reflective of this instrumentality that Islam really popularized and kind of valorized in many ways to inform its mapping projects. And when it comes to Islam and its spatial priorities, that is towards Mecca, we have a whole series of what are called Qibla maps that sort of orientate the viewer to Mecca and Medina. And of course, architecturally, mosques have to look towards Mecca, and there's a lot of orientation towards Mecca that the astrolabe kind of captures as it is used for. The astrolabe is basically an inclinometer. It measures angles, so it's used by astronomers and navigators to tell latitude primarily, but it can also tell altitude, and is a really just a sophisticated instrument that during the early Abbasid Caliphate, the son of Harun al-Rashid, Ma'mun, developed as we could call it a global scientific project at the Beit al-Hikmat to basically translate Greek and Roman, Byzantine texts, as well as Indian texts and knowledge. So what's happening in Baghdad is a synthesis of historic and global cartographic information and theories. And it is a real wonderful example of how maps are really, in many ways, kind of co-produced with other maps and other pressures on mapping. And what becomes sort of this Islamic mapping, we here have a map of El-Biruni, one of the worlds around the year 1000 AD, we can think roughly, arguably one of the two most influential intellectuals on the planet around that time, with Ibn Sina, Avicenna being the other. But El-Biruni was a mathematician who brought a kind of mathematical sensibility to the cartography of Islam. And El-Biruni gives us a sense that the world is connected by seas, kind of the first one to see the connections of all the world's water bodies. And what's happening leading up to El-Biruni is what is known in the literature as the Balkhi school of cartography. Balkh in northern Afghanistan, again, developed a really historically influential system of mapping the world through various regions. Ptolemy Ptolemy, whose work was the basis of all mapping activity until that point, saw the world through various 7 climactic zones. Each side of the equator, 7 climactic zones was the basis of Ptolemy's understanding of astronomy and math, and therefore mapping. And it's still an Earth-centric view, but what is happening in the Balkhi school of cartography is that the sort of mapping of 7 climates gave way to mapping 7 regions of the world, and it's the elaboration of that regional mapping that the Islamic experience really brings to the fore. And what we don't have from the Balkhi school is any residual actual textual products from that era. What we have to rely upon is a map from Istarhi, from a little after that time, that is probably the most known resource for the Balkhi school. And what's important about this image of Istarhi's map is it highlights the aspect of the Islamic historical experience focusing on texts and books, and of course the Quran and other legal texts, but there are substantive geographic narratives in the history of Islam. Al-Biruni is one of them. Ibn Battuta is another. So there's a really rich manuscript and textual tradition that we need to understand in the Islamic framework, to understand maps within that framework. And the prioritization of a manuscript tradition that led to the illumination or illustration of these manuscripts, particularly under the Mughal period, just wonderful, points to, first of all, the gold and other precious metals, including lapis lazuli, that impact the pigmentation of the inks and dyes. And what we have here is a really embeddedness of these visual map images in a larger textual tradition of Islam. And that is interesting because Islam really did not develop its own cartographic tradition. It did not bring to bear all of its astronomical and mathematical sciences to produce maps for their own purpose. Maps were seen as a part of a larger system of knowledge formation that was very literary, very historical, tied to elites, tied to literate classes. So it's really important to reflect, what do maps do for people? Who are using these maps and why? And again, Islam's great geographic expanse and the sort of commercial and political ramifications of that, again, really give us mapping pressures. Finally, just really by way of background, we have to think of maps with reference to paper. And paper itself is just such an important technology for the manuscript tradition of Islam more generally. But it's really in the 8th century that paper production from China gets really sort of monopolized by the Arabs. So Damascus, even Samarkand and Baghdad become centers of paper production. Really significant. Linguistically, there are a number of words that come into play, units of measurement, whether they're distances traveled, a day's journey, a manzil, or a distance. It could be a farsakh or a unit of measurement. And so the vocabulary of these maps goes across the Arabic, Persian, and Turkish linguistic domains. And again, the ramifications here lead to a wide variety of vocabulary. There's no one word for map. There's different words that are used to refer to maps. And that is also something to keep in mind as we now start to make our way in a much more speedy way through the remainder of our images here. And I'm sorry, my enthusiasm, I think, got the better of me with all of this. But the sort of legacy of Islam, for our purpose now, we need to focus on its articulation in the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire, again, a very textually rich domain, but not a lot of maps per se. We have some maps that can be recreated, such as this by Irfan Habib, who would be the scholar the Mughal historian who does the most with maps. And you can see what Irfan Habib has done in the 20th century is take the wealth of Mughal Persian language documents. And it's important to remember, the Mughal Empire ran on Persian, beginning in 1575 up until 1835, when the British finally sort of denuded Persian of its priority. But what this map gives us is a very wonderful expose on the natural resources and the ecology. If you can zoom in your eyes, at least, you can see words like cotton and rice and citron and wheat. So it's not a political map, it's really an environmental map, which speaks to the sensibilities that the Mughals had for their environment. And this is most especially true of Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, buried in Kabul, who made his name and reputation in and around Kabul, whose memoirs are a rich narrative geographical map of the Kabul region. And Babur's records, his autobiography, have been illustrated in such abundantly fabulous ways. Again, not maps per se. Now, the Mughals did have route maps, and this is a route map to Kandahar. And this speaks to the priority of Kandahar and Kabul for the Mughals, but also for the Safavids at the same time, between roughly the years 1500 and 1700. Aurangzeb, a later Mughal ruler, is known to have relied on maps. And this is the best I could do with a Mughal map of the northwestern region that would involve Afghanistan. It's illegible, but at least it exists in the National Archives of India for scholarly use. And they don't digitize, so I'm sorry to blur your lunch hour with this. During the Mughal Empire, we also have a wide variety of European travelers whose narratives and activities spawned maps of the Mughal Empire. And Tavernier, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, is a prominent figure in this regard. These are some of his maps of the Mughal Empire. And now we will go from the Mughal imperial perspective to sort of looking at early modern European maps of this region more broadly. And I will go fast, relatively fast, to capture what you'll see is a lot of different languages and perspectives, which speaks to various kinds of imperial interests and emphases in these maps that we have. This from downstairs, Cynthia, 1600s. This is 1600, I believe. They're just fantastic. I just can't say how fun it is to work down there, especially with the pre-modern maps that have such wonderful marginalia. And this marginalia is itself also just a system of information. We have basically ethnography and urban sort of history coming into play on this map here. And what fascinates me, again, about some of the marginalia is they're very instructive about the patrons and the methods and the reasons for the map appearing as it does. And if you go to the map library downstairs, you can scan for free. and you get huge files that are difficult to download and upload. But this is a sampling of some of them. Again, the marginalia. Here we get the maps from the Flemish cartographer, Abraham Ortelius. Again, in the 16th century, in this age of Dutch, really global commercial expansion, Ortelius is famous, and this is an online version of his World Atlas. He's the person he's most commonly referred to as the person who made the first World Atlas. That's a contested claim. But the atlas is a series of sheets of different parts of the world, and this is from South Asia. And that's from the Indian side, that's from the Iranian side. This is online at the World Digital Library, but when you go downstairs to Cindy's office, you get a different, I don't know how many copies of Ortelius we have here.
16,
Something like, this is one of them. We weren't able to get the date, but you can see it's just wonderfully illuminated with colors in a way the other one wasn't. And what's important to note here is we have the region of Afghanistan on the map, but we have it mapped incorrectly with, for example, you can see Kabul. I wish I had a pointer. You can see Kabul below Kandahar, to the south of Kandahar. Kabul and Kandahar are inverted, okay? And this, again, because these maps are in dialogue with one another, constantly being reprinted and redone, that relationship between Kandahar and Kabul is repeated in other maps, the incorrect, technically incorrect. But again, the map isn't designed necessarily for that kind of concern. This is better, I'm sorry. Ortelius is just a treasure downstairs, and Hirad and I actually were there together when we got this taken out. This is another very famous cartographer who is mapping Persia and Afghanistan. And the thing to note here, what have I done here?
Have to click out of that, the mouse. Just click anyway. Yeah.
Excuse me. That you can see the same relationships in Kabul and Kandahar is repeated here. But on this map, which is from William Jansus Blau, same era generally, is notable for the only mark of color on this otherwise black and white map is for a dash of red on a Persian. Now, this speaks to me, excuse me? The beard and the mustache, yep. And what I hypothesize is that this is the way this mapper referenced the Kizilbash, the red head. Hypothesis I will explore and be critiqued for in due course. Again, really just giving you a sense. In these maps, the marginalia that attracts me the most, again, would be the animals. I am into environmental things these days. And what's really interesting is that the presence of elephants and camels on these maps in the margins is just really very conspicuous. And what seems to be happening is that when the perspective comes from kind of South Asia, there's elephants on the map. When the perspective comes from the Middle East, you get camels on the map. And I just love that, again, since Afghanistan can be, again, synthetic in many ways. This is a late 18th century map that gets, this is my first indication of something produced in the US. I believe it's I want to say 1766, but I could be, based upon a British map that is, again, remember. Now, we come to my book. The first book, Connecting Histories in Afghanistan, is available online. You don't have to buy it, but if you like to, that's great. Books are wonderful. We're librarians in spirit today, and books are great. Digital publications also have their place, and my book was born digitally.
which allowed me to incorporate maps. And I could say it was the digital sort of production of this book that got me interested in maps in the first instance. And I will show you those images in due course. But my interest in the book and the role of maps in supporting the argument of the book is that colonialism really did something to Afghanistan. And the first thing it did is it privileged Kabul. Kabul became really now the center of this thing called Afghanistan, which was the colonial understanding of where people should be. And again, the mobility of Afghans makes this a really sort of complex proposition, as we may still be witnessing today. The book got incorporated in the ACLS Humanities ebook series, which is just another wonderful online source for just some of the world's greatest books. Certainly not this exceptional book on Afghanistan. This is where I began to think about Afghanistan without borders. And we have the engineer or architect of this map in the audience today, my son, who as a high school student was able to produce this using some software package that was cutting edge at the time and is now probably outdated, to give you a sense of how quickly the mapping changed. My book is really about the way I got around Kabul's sort of the narrative of Afghanistan about Kabul and about two British wars is I looked at market relations between these three cities. And the thing about these three cities is one of them ended up outside of Afghanistan, that's Peshawar. But that belies a deeper multi-millennial history of intimate connections between these regions that you can understand geographically. Even just looking at this, it's sort of a straight shot from Peshawar to Kabul to Kandahar. You have nice roads and valleys. Maybe a few miles in the Khyber are a little sketchy, but they're accessible cities. And they've been in dialogue. They've been in relationship. And so then I go through, there's 10 maps, and they begin in 1724, I believe. And they go through the mid-1800s. And the argument here is that there is this relationship where Kabul was mapped, and very prominently so. Gradually, this thing called Afghanistan gets mapped, first faintly, then more boldly and broadly, and then Afghanistan sort of takes over Kabul and everything else around him as a cartographic category. And there's a lot of political processes behind that, but there's that dialectic where Afghanistan sort of triumphs over Kabul. And I go through these maps and look at them. They're largely, again, from David Rumsey, multiple European maps. And I focus on that relationship between Kandahar and Kabul. So each map has a smaller screen where I focus in on Kandahar and Kabul. Okay? And I'm going to go through these really quickly because you've got them online. Not all of them, one of the shortcomings of a printed book is it's expensive to print maps. And so they put only 2 or 3 in there. It's just wonderful. Again, German mapping, different configurations. Once Afghanistan does get mapped, it looks different to different people. It's an interesting story. This, I believe, the important thing about these maps, Johnson's and Colton's, is they're United States products. And we start getting a lot of these. There's, I want to say, scores downstairs between the 1850s and 1890s of these kind of colorful renditions, which other empires are doing. And what we have to appreciate is that mapping becomes a globally, it's a form of knowledge that's very dynamic and interactive. And once a mapping development happens, it gets sort of adopted and it takes holds in other ways. And there's a lot of redundancy and repetition in the cartographic oeuvre of Afghanistan because of that. Alexander the Great's presence in Afghanistan is something that all imperial mappers were consumed with in the modern era because they all, modern European nation states, are staking claim to Alexander's heritage in so many ways. And so there's, I will say 100, and I'll have to be proven wrong, Alexander maps downstairs. French maps, I'm going to just go through these. These are maps that did not make it into my book. This one, I wish I could have, because what this says is Kabul ou Afghanistan. A map that says, I'm reading this as or. And again, there's a history of French language. I'm not sure if it's actually or. Maybe someone can help me. I understood it to have some changing meanings, and I'm so happy to confirm that Mary Jane has confirmed my hunch, because when have you seen a map that says this or that? You're either here or you're there. You're in Kabul or you're in Afghanistan. What's happening here? Kabul or Afghanistan? More Alexander. Most of these European maps have a rather consistent physical and material sort of profile. Again, there are some exceptions where this becomes much larger and more rectangular. Particular regions, the Suleiman Mountains, become an object of mapping. Russian maps, this is our first Russian map of the Amu Darya, 1873, and we'll hopefully get back into that. Rand McNally, the US atlas producer, is producing maps for their atlases, and now we need to start appreciating what I tell my students are some rules of the map road. That is, first of all, maps are always incomplete, and that puts a pressure on refining the map. And that can lead to what's called map anxiety. Make a better map, the map's got to be better, constantly. Maps also relate to texts. There's always a narrative or a text associated with or behind the map, or indeed sort of on the page with the map. We saw an earlier map that has sort of narrative with it. Maps relate constantly to other maps. Maps are in dialogue with other maps in a sort of metaphorical way. And again, the audience is important here because Afghanistan is now being mapped into the American sort of public consciousness, as it were. And we can see that Afghanistan's place in global affairs, that is with the sort of late 19th, early 20th century question about essentially the demise of the Ottoman Empire. The Eastern question gets mapped, and Afghanistan gets mapped into that sort of geopolitical frame of reference. Rand McNally, from 1885, the map you just saw, to 1897, improved its map, got a little more accurate, a little cleaner, and again, Rand McNally can never have the quest for perfection is ongoing when it comes to maps. Okay, so my second book about Mount Stuart Elphinstone is really designed to bring this figure of Mount Stuart Elphinstone into scholarly view as someone who has two separate histories. Mount Stuart Elphinstone has been seen as a major, prominent player in British India, involved with all kinds of urban revolutions with sanitation and legal and administrative, architectural, infrastructure kind of in Bombay. He was asked to be a Governor General of British India. He wrote a history of India in 1841 that kind of put him on the map of scholars. And he is known to be relevant to British India for the most part, except those few people who work on Afghanistan, who know that Elphinstone is actually in many ways the founder of Afghanistan studies, because he wrote the book, the first colonial handbook of Afghanistan, called not History of Afghanistan, an account of the Kingdom of Kabul, Elphinstone saw Kabul. He did not see Afghanistan. Elphinstone, my work with him is to sort of bridge these two gaps. Elphinstone, the Indianist, Elphinstone, the Afghanist, and that's really what that book is all about. My contribution intellectually to the book is around his maps. And what's important about maps in general, and this is sort of the elephant in the room, is there's a history of printing. The sort of the Gutenberg Revolution and printing, there's a sort of sub-history to all of this that's routed through printing. Elphinstone produces the first map of the Kingdom of Kabul when he writes the first encyclopedia for Afghanistan, and in that way, Elphinstone sets the epistemological framework, the ways of understanding Afghanistan. It's Elphinstone. And what we see here is that this book is the product of his diplomatic mission. He was the ambassador, the first British ambassador to the court of Shah Shuja, the Kingdom of Kabul, in 1808 to 1810. And that mission is a diplomatic embassy where he had 13 other British officers working on all kinds of geologic, astronomical, as well as cartographic issues, as we'll see. So it's a huge embassy that gathered, as these things do, lots of information from lots of sources over a couple of years. And Elphinstone sort of systematizes and synthesizes all of that embassy information for a book that's published first in 1815. That is 5 years after the mission itself. It gets republished in 1819. It gets republished in 1839, leading up to the first British invasion, to become literally the handbook for the war. And what the sort of history of this book gets us into the history of the book and the history of printing. And Elphinstone's book changes its format from 1 to 2 volumes, illustrations or not, that kind of thing, in many ways because of the map. The first map that you'll see from Elphinstone is tied to a number of other maps. And what I want to do really now is to give you a sense of the dynamic relationship that Elphinstone had to his information, that he had to the map, and that the sort of maps have in among themselves. This is the map in question. The map published in an account of the Kingdom of Kabul in 1815. And what this map reflects is that it is based upon another map. That is the map produced by Lieutenant John McCartney, who is the official mapper of the mission. We'll see John McCartney's map in a second. Note that there's no Afghanistan in the title or insignia here, but it does appear very faintly, and if I had the flicker, Afghanistan appears, as does the Kingdom of Kabul. So it's a really complex map. It's got different colors. You can see that capture Elphinstone's route. So Elphinstone is the second documented European to get to this region called Afghanistan. Forster in the earlier period, the 17th century, also kind of, had a narrative. And you can see there, Elphinstone leaves Delhi and makes his way. Did not know where Kabul was. He leaves Delhi really not knowing where Kabul was. And that's kind of part of the project, was to bring Afghanistan into the colonial mapping fold. Elphinstone had to petition his superiors to publish his map. The reason that there were restrictions on publishing maps was because of the global war with France, who had invaded Egypt, and the great threat of France invading Afghanistan through Iran really is what led Elphinstone to be dispatched to Kabul to get a treaty of alliance in case of the French invasion. At the same time, John Malcolm was sent to Persia for the same purpose. And Elphinstone, to get his map published, had to reference this map, a map of 1813 that's produced by John MacDonald Kinnear, but it's of Persia. And what's important about this, he titles his map, as you can see, but the geographic space is Persia. And what you can see is that the critical information of this map was out in the public, and Elphinstone used that accessibility of these passes, potential mountain passes for the French to go through, to publish his map. Elphinstone had to say, there's already a published map of this area. My stuff isn't so sensitive that it can't be published, so publish my map. And that's a really long archival story. Kinnear's map of Persia of 1813 also relates to Malcolm's map. I told you Malcolm was dispatched to Persia. He produces a map from that mission, very similar to Kinnear. The real template for all of these mapping projects is the map of India that was produced by James Rennell, or Rennell. James Rennell or Rennell, I'm not precisely sure the pronunciation. But his mapping of India, sort of all India into cartographic view, led to the Great Trigonomical Survey and really the sort of institution for continually mapping India. You can see there's really no Afghanistan on the map. Where there's density of visual stimulus, that means mountains, roads, and cities. That means a lot of information. Where you can pack a lot of information into your map, you know a lot about that place. And you can see the gap that Afghanistan, geographic Afghanistan, represents here. There's nothing known about it. And Elphinstone is sent to learn something and map it. This would be the area where we would expect to find Kabul. And I think we do get Kabul, but not Kandahar. So Rennell is the template. And Elphinstone references Rennell in his map. He says, I'm doing this to sort of extend the line that Rennell established in India. So Elphinstone publishes his map in 1815, but it's not the digital age, so he has to send things to London, which takes time. The first edition did not get the latest corrections that Elphinstone had sent along to his map. So essentially, the second volume of An Account of the Kingdom of Kabul in 1819 has a new map based upon the updated information. And then in the 1830s, Alexander Burns, the very famous colonial actor, some say he's the template for kind of James Bond, a real famous spy feted by the Queen, and just really very prominent in the history of Afghanistan and Central Asia, publishes his map, produced in conjunction with his local guide and informant, Mohanlal Kashmiri, in 1834, based upon years in the environment and Mohanlal's ability to read Persian. And Elphinstone then is confronted with this more accurate map produced in the 1830s. What does he do with his map in 1839? Well, he writes a note and says, look, I corrected my map in the second edition, but Burns's map is better. So rather than confusion for anyone using this map as you're about to invade Afghanistan, I'm going to revert to my original incorrect map and direct you all to Burns. And of course, Burns becomes a major figure in the first occupation of Kabul and the decimation of the first British Army of Occupation. In fact, it's his assassination that lights off the revolt that leads to the disastrous evacuation. Burns is killed on November 7th, 1841. The British try to retreat outside of Kabul in early January and are decimated en route. So Burns titles his map as follows. And what's going on here, it's now time to take stock of the role of capitalism, not just in the formation of early modern empires, but as a sort of, again, agency for all kinds of intellectual and artistic production. And the sort of capitalist involved, the entrepreneur, the cartographic entrepreneur that has his hand in all of these maps is named John Arrowsmith. And John Arrowsmith is kind of the mapper for the empire. He's in London receiving information, textual and visual, from all over the world, and he produces these wonderful maps that, again, are published for the British and wider imperial audience and end up being really foundational for what we could call public knowledge of the world. He's a fantastically important figure in these map histories of Afghanistan. This is the most important thing you will see today. This is the map produced by the official mapper of Elphinstone's embassy. They weren't called mappers, they were called surveyors. Lieutenant John McCartney was recruited from China to come and produce this map for Elphinstone. And one of the things about these master mappers, Rennell, sort of an exception, is they tend to die really early. Rennell lived a long time. McCartney died shortly after submitting his map, his sort of final product. And this is it. McCartney and Elphinstone relied on the same information, the same body of information, the same informants, the same data, and they produced radically different textual artifacts. Elphinstone's map folds out of a book. It's small. This is a big map. It's multiple tables. This map is not of the Kingdom of Kabul. McCartney thinks he's mapping basically the Punjab and the Indus. The Indus attracts so much cartographic emphasis and scientific emphasis during this period. It's really phenomenal. And what we see through that is that the ecology of Afghanistan, its maps and mountains, its rivers and mountains are things that get mapped and help bring the whole thing into shape. It's a fantastic story. McCartney doesn't just have a different visual, material, aesthetic product. He has a different conceptual and theoretical product, because maps are supposed to indicate things about the real world. That is how this place called Kabul, called Afghanistan, operates. Who's there? How do they relate? How are they organized? Elphinstone has a full book, 800 pages, to explain his map in that sense. McCartney has his archival notes, a couple hundred pages, but very different, sort of memoir of this map. And all maps kind of have texts or memoirs associated with them. The intervention here, what we can see basically is the following conclusion. Elphinstone is so important for Afghanistan because he placed Pashtuns and Pashto at the cultural and historic core of the Afghan nation. I'll say that again. Elphinstone positions Pashtuns culturally, historically, politically at the core of the people called Afghans, a broader group that fits into Afghanistan from the colonial mindset. So Pashtuns are organically Afghans, and maybe the sort of most important. And this privileging of Pashtuns into Afghans, as we heard about, is extremely problematic. Extremely problematic for so many different reasons. In fact, today, the sort of political tensions between Afghan and Pashtun are kind of all over the electoral map, if nothing else, in Afghanistan today. So Elphinstone succeeds by being an authoritative, living scholar, administrator for putting that view of Afghanistan not only on the map and in the book, but in terms of policy. So Afghanistan has to be a place where Kabul is the capital, Pashtuns are the rulers, and it's got these boundaries, and just whatever happens after that, the violence inflicted on Afghanistan by the map, don't worry. But that reading of Afghanistan and Elphinstone's framing of it that way are enduring. They're alive today in policy and intellectual circles. They're the majority view. The minority view is McCartney, where you can see faintly, first of all, his methodology is different than Elphinstone, where you can see Elphinstone used only words that were in printed terms fonts of larger and smaller size, either sort of bold or italic or hollow. And what Elphinstone did with his map, I'll just go back to it for the unpleasant scrolling impact. I apologize, but just so you understand that Elphinstone's map does not have a kind of key or code to it. It's just letters that you can see, even at this distance, have different sort of density, intensity, importance, and priority. Really bold to really small, spread out or concentrated. And that methodology is distinct. This would be a good time to check your text messages or whatever you have to do, because I'm going to go back to McCartney's map, which has a different methodology to it, where he places Roman numerals in certain areas to indicate the geographic dispersion of these people. Again, he's dealing with mobility in a different way than Elphinstone. Okay? And what he does is use Roman numerals and scatter them about. But those numerals also have different colors. They do represent sort of different things. And the bottom line is that he separates the two major Pashtun tribes, Duranis and Ghilzais, from Afghans. McCartney separates Pashtuns from Afghans. And it's a scientific conclusion that the master mapper leaves for posterity. And I'll just conclude with some mapping of the defeat of the British, the decimation of the British invasion force. And just finally, because it's only after the Second War that Afghanistan takes cartographic shape as we know it today. And those, that process after the Second Afghan War led to boundary missions. And the bounding and the boundary missions generate just a huge amount of maps that are so exciting for future scholars. And what I will leave with is sort of the end of the imperial mapping of Afghanistan. We spent too much time talking about it. I'm sorry to not leave enough time for questions. But what I want to contrast imperial mapping with is national mapping. And I hope to be able to share with you some thoughts on the sort of Afghanistan mapping itself, so to speak, in the 20th century. And I can't thank you enough for sharing so much of your special Eid lunch hour with me, and for all of the supporters and facilitators who made this happen. It's been a great privilege, a great honor. I wish you all the best with your continued thinking about Afghanistan. Thank you.